between the 16th and 18th centuries, it is estimated that 30 to 60,000 people were executed on accusations of witchcraft in early modern Europe. Europe was colder back then, between 1300 to 1850, a period known as the Little Ice Age, where crop shortages were the norm. This probably only exacerbated the problems of war and disease that were going on at this time. Perhaps witches were used as scapegoats for pent-up frustration and growing social unrest. Maybe the witch trials were all just some diversion tactic by the church, to get people to point the finger at someone else. I mean, they had a lot of power back then, and a lot of times they ran the show. Don't look at the church, it's witchcraft. It's those people, they're casting spells, they're causing the crops to fail and disease to break out. Of course, a lot of these arguments are just speculation, hypotheses. They're theories because, well, it was a different time back then. We don't know if all those accused were really guilty. I mean, we aren't perfect, and even today we still sentence people on false charges all the time. What we do know for sure, though, is that the majority of those accused were from the lower economic classes in European society. Most historians agree that many of the accused were innocent in any involvement in devil worship, and that they confessed to witchcraft because they were tortured into doing so. Perhaps this was all just mass superstition. I mean, if you take a look at the accounts, it looks like people were going batshit crazy. What would cause them to go crazy? I mean, full-on schizophrenic. Not that I believe 60,000 people were schizophrenic, but I mean flailing, lashing out, seeing things that aren't there. As I was going over these cases, I was starting to fall into this way of thinking that these people are all just crazy, superstitious, religious fanatics, and their victims were just peasants, outcasts, who were in no position to defend themselves. But what if these confessions were honest? All the hallucinations and delusions, what if the victims or perpetrators, depending on who you ask, what if they weren't making it up? This brings us to another question. What is it like to look through the eyes of the insane? I think Aldous Huxley's description in his essay Heaven and Hell provides a good place to start. In the essay, he references a woman who began to descend into schizophrenia around the age of 5 and who only goes by Renee. Huxley writes, "The world of the schizophrenic is called Le Pays de Clermont, the country of lit-upness. It is a name which a mystic might have used to denote his heaven, but for poor Renee, the schizophrenic, the illumination is infernal. Everything that for healthy visionaries is a source of bliss brings to Renee only fear and a nightmarish sense of reality. The summer sunshine is malignant. The gleam of polished surfaces is suggestive, not of gems, but of machinery and enameled tin. The intensity of existence which animates every object is felt as a menace." This description seems eerily similar to the confessions of the accused witches in Finnmark, the most northern district of Norway. "She confessed that Dortha Larsdatter from Skatora had learned her witchcraft, which she gave her in some warm milk one day as she returned from church, cold and frozen. In the same plate of milk, something black was lying, which Dortha insisted she should eat, saying, 'Just eat it. It won't hurt you. It is just some crushed pepper.' But when she had consumed it, a small gray bird came to her like a sparrow and walked to and fro at her feet until it finally disappeared from her eyes. 3 days later, Satan himself came to her. And here's Gunnel Olsdatter, condemned in 1625. The previously mentioned Scrap Ann gave her a piece of fish to eat. In addition, her daughter also gave her a piece of bread. But just as she was eating it, Anne said, "God give! Now the devil got into you." And at once Gunnel suffered pain, and it was as if something living had entered her. A while later, Satan came to her outside the door as a black dog. And Gunhild Olsdatter, 1663. She confessed to have learned witchcraft from a woman in Nordland by a drink of beer that she got. It made her quite bewildered. This woman who learned her the art sent her a substance which looked like a blue starch. She was told to put it into the food of the schoolmaster of the woman's children. Instead, she gave it to a dog, which became so mad that it ran into the sea and drowned. Out of 85 trials, 42 of them share something in common. The witchcraft wasn't obtained from another person or by chance. It was consumed. Looking over these cases, you'll see that 17 of them mention bread or other flour products, and 23 of these cases mention that they obtained witchcraft through milk or beer. In several of the cases involving milk, witches testified that some kind of black, grain-like object was found in the drink. Now, what can cause a grain of rye to turn black? It could be that the grain object was burned, or it was a piece of dirt or something, or like in the first account, it was just a piece of pepper. But the author of this article points out that this dark, grain-like object described in the above accounts could in fact be ergot, or in other words, Claviceps purpurea. Claviceps purpurea is a parasitic fungus that grows on grains of rye and some grasses. To become infected, a fungal spore must enter the stigma, which is the part of the plant that receives the pollen. Once infected, the fungal mycelium destroys the plant ovary and connects with the vascular bundle originally intended for feeding the developing seed. The fungus produces a structure called a sclerotium inside the husk of the floret. The interesting thing about sclerotia is that they are resistant to temperatures and remain alive during winter, or during the storage of crops, which you'll see becomes an important detail later on in this discussion. But what makes the Claviceps purpurea fungus so intriguing to me is that its sclerotia contains a number of alkaloids, such as ergotamine, the same alkaloid Albert Hofmann used to first synthesize LSD in 1938. Ergot alkaloids are structurally similar to several neurotransmitters, acting as partial agonists and antagonists of alpha-adrenergic, dopaminergic, and serotonergic receptors. And different strains of ergot contain different combinations of alkaloids, most likely explaining the two forms of ergotism, convulsive and gangrenous. The convulsive kind leads to neurological disturbances, convulsions, and even epilepsy. People with the disease were drowsy, sometimes delirious, lethargic, having hallucinations and double vision. Some affected individuals developed profuse sweating, fever, muscle stiffness, and twitching. As the disorder progressed, the trunk of the body could become bent through spasms, rolling up into a ball or rigid in extension. These abnormal postures could last for minutes or hours. What makes this condition unique, I think, are the reports of crawling sensations underneath the skin and seriously disturbed perception. Then she confessed that she had learnt such witchcraft of smelled and by some flour for soup which she had given her Furthermore, that Anne had a black cat which she was asked to fondle. When she had done this and also eaten some of the flour, her mind became so queer. She had pains and felt as if she was flying in the air. Thereafter, she tried the art on a goat kid which she gave a mouthful of bread, and just afterwards it died. The trial of Martha Rasmusdottir, tried and condemned in 1653, states thus: She confessed to having learnt such witchcraft from Sigrid of Steinsland, who gave her such knowledge in a piece of bread while she was starving. From this, she immediately became so disturbed that she could not help thinking she was in hell. Or another accused, Mary Thomasdottir, condemned in 1655. She learned at first from Sigrid, as noted above, in a piece of bread, which, when she had eaten it, made the earth start to run around her, and at once the devil came to them with claws on hands and feet. And in the confession of Karen Monstadter, who received the death sentence in 1626, she confessed that Narv Ann gave her a drink of beer. Thereby, she got the art that she could fly in the air wherever she wanted. Other ergot alkaloids are vasoconstrictive, and the resulting narrowing of the blood vessels may lead to parts of your body rotting away. Here's an account of a witch who used her witchcraft to inflict harm on two persons. She put a spell on Nud Larsson's wife in Vadsø, calling the evil spirit down on her, whereupon the woman instantly fainted, got very ill, and finally died thereof. At the autopsy, her back and thighs were found to be as blue as the bottom of a kettle. In several cases, the court documents suggest that the witches had been bitten by the devil in their fingers, arms, and feet. But how did the grain get there? Since they lived so far north, the people of Finnmark had access to two potentially important sources of ergot-infested grain: imported grain and wild grain. Based on reports of the Adelaide Commission in 1690, a common man could hardly expect to receive more than 1 or 2 barrels of flour per year for their entire family. In times of need, the lay people of Finnmark were likely to have utilized whatever sources of food available, including the grain of wild limegrass, a plant known to be frequently infected by ergot. It might come to no surprise that limegrass occurs commonly on the sandy beaches of the Varangur Peninsula, within the area of Finnmark most heavily affected by the witch trials. As I mentioned earlier, the people most often accused of witchcraft were also the poorest in society. Starving in the freezing cold, they did their best to survive on whatever they could, even if it meant collecting wild rye. Stories of ergotism outbreaks in Central Europe probably never reached the isolated, far northern parts of Finnmark. At least, not for a while after. Just imagine you were living in this strictly Puritan Protestant setting, probably growing up hearing folk tales and Bible stories about demons and the devil. One day in this cold and dark landscape, you start to see things that aren't really there. An unbearable sensation overtakes you of something crawling underneath your skin, drawing your every thought. Your neighbors are struck with paranoia, they think you're delusional, and their suspicions are only heightened as you begin to have these wild, involuntary spasms. Now take yourself with these symptoms and go high above the Arctic Circle in the winter, where the sun never rises. It doesn't take a stretch of one's imagination to picture how all these environmental pieces might produce something akin to your worst living nightmare. I would have probably seen the devil too. Huxley writes, Dante's sinners are buried in mud, shut up in the trunks of trees, frozen solid in blocks of ice, crushed beneath stones. The inferno is psychologically true. Many of its pains are experienced by schizophrenics and by those who have taken mescaline or lysergic acid under unfavorable conditions.